me start out by talking about the election of the President of the United States. The setting up of the Electoral College is very confusing to many people because we have a popular election and then we have the president actually selected by electors. So you go and vote for a president and a vice president, and actually that doesn't elect him. It just shows which of the parties has the predominance of that particular state, and then that party gets to select the electors under the supervision of the state legislature. All right, now that's the way the Electoral College is set up, and as the founders originally designed it, it was a very wise approach. We really haven't been administering it quite as effectively as it was designed, and that really does need some attention. But they still feel in Washington that it's better than having a popular election for a number of reasons. Now let's just first of all consider here what the Electoral College provides, and that's number 7 here in your outline. In the original Electoral College, how many did each elector vote for? And that's 2. The idea was that you're voting for a president and a vice president. And the man that gets the most votes is president, and the number 2 man is vice president. Now, they had to change that because when John Adams became president, his number 1 political opponent was vice president. You know, kind of waiting around for him to die or something, resign, etc. And you almost need a food taster when your vice president is your number 1 opponent, you know. In any event, no, that wasn't kind. I shouldn't have said that. All right, the 12th Amendment changed that so that each party has to put up 1 person for president and 1 person for vice president. Now, the founders did not anticipate a 2-party system. They knew there would be groups, you know, but they just didn't think they would actually concentrate into 2 major parties. So the answer to that is no. And now, has this worked out better than the multi-party system in Europe? And the answer is definitely yes. Much more stable and successful. Yes. How many electors can each state appoint? Now, how many congressmen do you have in your state? Just think in your mind. How many congressmen do you have? All right. How many senators do you have? All right. That is what decides how many electors you can have. And let's put down then, it's the total number of your senators and representatives. Now, let me ask you, do the small states have an advantage over the big states in the Senate? Yes or no? Well, from a representation standpoint. Yes, they definitely do. And that was the effort of the Founding Fathers to build the you know, you've heard of separation of powers and checks and balance. It was to give a little balance, a little extra clout to the little states, the new states, the poor states, the undeveloped states. Otherwise, today you see the 12 big states in the United States would pass every law, would elect every president, and all of the rest of us 38 little states would sit by and, you know, watch the parade go by. So the founders put some extra clout in there, and that's what the Senate does. It's a very wise system. For example, take Utah with a 1 million population. It has 2 representatives, and it has 2 senators. That's 4 electoral votes, isn't it? Now across the way is Oregon. It has 2 million people. It has 4 congressmen, and it has 2 senators. But it only has 6 electoral votes compared to Utah's 4 electoral votes, even though it has twice the population. Isn't that interesting? Now, compared to California, of course, it isn't much clout, or they've got 45, I think it is. But in any event, it was just an effort by the founders to give the little states and the new states and the unpopulated states a chance to be in there. Everybody follow that? Let's go now here to the next one. Is it possible on occasion for the popular election to go one way and the Electoral College to vote the other? Actually, that's happened 3 times, but 2 of them are highly questionable. There's only been 1 clear-cut case, and it's just a question of a very close percentage. It's just the way the thing lines up on a very close election where that can happen. Ordinarily, it would not. Now, is each elector required to vote the choice of his party? And the answer is no, but they always do. Nearly always. We've only had about 17 mavericks out of 17,000 electoral votes cast, they tell me. When do the electors meet to give their vote? The 2nd Monday in December, following their election. this second Monday in December, following their election. So it's Monday in December, and they usually meet at their state capital to cast their ballot. All right, now who can serve as president? He has to be natural born, a natural born citizen, or a citizen at the time of the adoption of the Constitution in 1789. That's kind of interesting. See, they had some very notable people who were not born in the United States, who were at the convention. And maybe one of them will become president. For example, James Wilson from Scotland, very outstanding patriot. So they said, well, they either have to be native born or a citizen at the time this Constitution goes into operation. So as of now, you see, we don't have any of those left. So it has to be someone who's natural born. Let's ask a question. What if an ambassador has a child while he's living in Greece? Is that child natural born? A natural born citizen. He's natural born. They're all born naturally. What I mean is he what they would call a natural born citizen? Well, if he was born at the embassy, at least they could argue that's U.S. territory. But if he's born at a Greek hospital, my goodness. You know that point's never been argued in the courts. But if it were, I think they would say, well, under those circumstances, yes. But you don't know. It says natural born, that's what it says. Now, he's got to be 35 years of age at the time he's sworn in. He can run at 34, got to be 35 when he's sworn in. He must have been a resident of the United States 14 years. Now, Franklin had been outside of the United States for 25 out of the last 30 years. And so they wanted someone who had been in the nation and had been close to them, close to the needs of the country for the last 14 years. Anybody got that? All right, now what happens if the president dies or is impeached or unable to function in his office? This was partially handled by the 25th Amendment, but it has some very definite weaknesses we will discuss when we get to the 25th Amendment. Does it provide for a situation where both the president and the vice president might be killed in an accident together? No, it does not. That's left up to provisions by Congress, and the Congress has passed an act to try and take care of that. All right, how much is the president paid each year? $200,000. And how much does he get for expenses? $50,000. What does he get for retirement? $60,000. Plus about $90,000 for office help, because some of our presidents, when they retired, were absolutely bankrupted trying to maintain an honorable position as ex-presidents. So they found it was desirable in the interest of the United States to do that. A wife who is a widow of a president gets $20,000 a year. Now, what was President Washington's salary? It was $25,000 a year, but he didn't accept any of it. Now, before taking over his office, the president has to take an oath of office. And he promises that he will faithfully execute, or meaning to carry out, the duties of the president. That's first. He will execute the duties of a president, carry them out faithfully, and he will protect and defend the Constitution. Defend and protect the Constitution. Now, back in the days of, I remember when, in the days of President Taft, President Wilson, there was a lot of talk about impeaching presidents who were doing unconstitutional things. We seldom talk about that anymore because I'd say half of the decisions the president has to make today are outside the Constitution. Nobody talks about impeachment for that, unless there's high crimes or misdemeanors of a very serious nature, as occurred with President Nixon. But in any event, they originally intended that a president would be impeached if he did not protect and defend the Constitution as written and by the Founding Fathers. Now, what about the phrase, "so help me God"? When was that added? It wasn't put on the books as a requirement until 1862. But President Washington was the first one to use it. When Chief Justice John Jay asked him with his hand on the Bible, President Washington was asked if he would do all of these things and uphold the Constitution, and he said, "I will, so help me God." So every president said it after that, but it was not required by statute till 1862. Now, who is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Services? The President. And is he commander of the militia when they are called up to serve the federal government? Yes. Not only the regular army, but also the state militia. So it's first president, then yes. Now, supposing they don't think the president's a very good commander-in-chief, could they appoint somebody else? No. Constitution says he's the commander-in-chief, period. Now, is there provision for the president's cabinet? No. But it refers to the principal officers who must be accountable to the president, and that is developed into a cabinet or a council. That was inevitable. All right? Now, the president has the power to grant reprieves. He sort of represents the conscience of the country. You know, sometimes the wheels of justice grind slowly and all of the rules are obeyed, but when it's all said and done, boy, that thing came out so nobody feels too good about it. Or the man's been convicted, but all of a sudden there's new evidence that ought to be considered. Already he's been sentenced. They rush to the president and ask for a reprieve. This is in federal cases. Otherwise, it's the governor, of course, if it's in state cases. Now, what's a reprieve? It's postponing the execution of a sentence. So it's postpone is your first blank. And what's a pardon? Well, a pardon is where the President of the United States feels that an injustice is being done, and so he excuses the individual from being punished. And that's what that is, punished. Now, must a person be formally convicted of a crime before the President can pardon him? The Constitution says that the President can pardon offenses, not convictions. And so when President Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, there was great criticism because the prosecutors were trying to bring out some things the public hadn't heard about before. And so they said, let us go ahead and prosecute him, and then after he's convicted, then you can pardon him. No, President Ford said, this thing has gone far enough, and the Constitution says I can pardon his offenses, and so I do. I pardon his offenses, both known and unknown. Now, that was a very unpopular thing. I don't know whether you recall it or not, but at the moment, President Ford was riding a very high plateau of public support. And the pardoning of Richard Nixon without allowing his offenses to be clearly defined and described in a case in court caused the president's popularity to go down very fast. So the answer is no. The president does not have to wait until he's convicted before pardoning him. The next one is offense. That's all that the Constitution says. He can pardon any offense. Can a person be pardoned after he's been impeached? And the answer is no. The reason he's impeached is to get him out of the government. Now, Parliament used to impeach the king's people, and then he'd put them right back in by pardoning them. Our founding fathers said, we'll have none of that malarkey. I mean, when we've impeached a judge, he's out, and there's not going to be a reappointment by the president because he's pardoned him. All right. When the president makes a treaty with a foreign power, what is necessary before the treaty goes into effect as part of the supreme law of the land? The Senate must have approved it by 2/3 of those present. Now, that doesn't mean 2/3 of the whole membership. It means that as of the day it was presented, 2/3 of those present had to approve it. How's the president got around this inconvenience where he wanted to make some rather delicate arrangements with foreign countries? He's done it in summit meetings and very often secretly entered into executive agreements. The word is executive there in number 4. Now, this clearly violates both the spirit and the intent of the Constitution. In fact, I ask that as a question. Does that violate the intent and spirit of the Constitution? The answer is yes. Now, what's the remedy? It would just merely require an act of Congress to tell the president There are to be no agreements at summit meetings. He can meet with these heads of government, but no agreements can be entered into. Now, President is empowered to nominate ambassadors and judges and so forth, and then they have to be approved with the advice and consent of the Senate. That just requires a majority vote, not 2/3. All right, now supposing I entered the FBI, excuse me, as a special agent, does my appointment have to be approved by Congress? No, fortunately. It was just approved by the heads of departments, which in my case was the Attorney General and Mr. Hoover, who is his head of the FBI. The heads of department, the Constitution said, can be authorized by Congress to make appointments to minor positions. Number 6, but what if an important position requiring the advice and consent of the Senate becomes vacant while Congress is not in session? Then the President is allowed to commission someone to serve in that position. See, the Founding Fathers thought of all these little details. The President commissions somebody, and then when the Congress comes into session, if they don't take any action actually approving that man, he's out at the end of the next session of Congress. As soon as Congress adjourns without having approved him, why, he's out. So end is the next blank. How often may the President address the Congress? As often as he feels it is necessary. Could go up there every week if he wanted to. Must he deliver it in person? No, that's not necessary. As a matter of fact, Jefferson began the pattern of having all his speeches read. He didn't like to give speeches in public. And that went clear down to President Wilson. And President Wilson began giving them again in person. And they have ever since. Can the President recommend to Congress certain legislation? Yes, you bet. That's what the Congress said, the Constitution says he is supposed to do. Does it say he can lobby for that legislation, or should he just leave it up to the Congress? There's no authority for him to lobby. But what is the most powerful lobby in Washington today? It's the White House. Why is it so powerful? Because the White House has the expenditures of billions of dollars. The expenditures of funds gives the White House tremendous power to lobby for its legislation. This is something the founders never anticipated, and it needs to be re-examined. Now, all right, number 3, if the Congress is adjourned, may the President call them back into session. Yes, for extraordinary circumstances such as war or financial emergency. Yes, and extraordinary are your 2 blanks. Now, in case the House and the Senate cannot agree on a time to adjourn, may the President say, as of 9 o'clock Monday morning, you are adjourned. Yes, but he's never had to do that. They've always been able to work it out. But the Constitution says he can. Now the President is supposed to receive ambassadors and dignitaries, but usually that's done by the State Department. And that's your blank, State Department. What if an ambassador has been accepted and then we don't like him anymore? We find him spying and doing all kinds of things against the interest of the United States. In fact, one ambassador from England got involved in a presidential election one year, and then when the other man was elected, he handed the ambassador his passport. Said, depart. All you have to do is give an ambassador his passport and he's through. He's on his way home. Now the President is required to see that the laws of the United States are faithfully executed. Remember that? What if he doesn't agree with the law and doesn't think it's right? Well, his first opportunity, if the law was passed during his period of administration, is to veto it. And that's your next blank. What if they pass the law over his veto with a 2/3 vote? Now, he has to execute it unless there is an option. This occurred during the Eisenhower administration when a Democratic Congress began just pouring billions out to the farmers of America to get them to sign up and receive all of this vast amount of money. But the Secretary of Agriculture was Ezra Taft Benson. So he went around to the farmers and he said, I recommend as a fellow farmer that you don't sign. You're going to lose control of your property. And you'll notice if you read the fine print, there's a lot of disadvantages. I recommend you don't sign. It's up to you. You'll get the money if you sign, but I recommend you keep your freedom and your farm and not sign. Up in Minnesota, they threw rotten eggs at him. But pretty soon, people began listening, and they began reading the provisions. And when he left in 1960, 80% of all American agriculture was free and independent. Now, since that time, it's drifted back, as you know, under a lot of federal control. But that was his, did I say 80? It was 80%. All right, 80%. And now section 4, by what means can the president, vice president, or any other civil officer of the government be removed? It's by impeachment. And that means a charge brought in the House of Representatives, then he's tried in the Senate. So it's impeachment, House, and Senate. And of course, if the president is being tried in the Senate, the Chief Justice must preside. That's in another part of the Constitution. Well, what can you be impeached for? Here are the offenses for which a president can be impeached: treason, bribery, high crimes and misdemeanors, high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, has any president ever been impeached? That is, convicted of the charges in the impeachment? No. What president escaped by merely one vote? Andrew Johnson. And he turned out to be right, and the reason for impeaching him turned out to be, at least politically, philosophically, an error. But it was just the vote of one congressman that kept President Johnson from being impeached. Who is the only president who ever resigned under threat of impeachment? And that was Richard Nixon. There are a lot of things connected with that tragic event that has never really come out and been made public. That whole story one day will probably be ventilated, but it has not yet. And I couldn't help but feel that Washington has allowed itself to become tremendously complicated because of a lot of those erosions of constitutional principles, and it tends to trap some people, congressmen, senators, and a president. If they don't go back there with an ironclad determination to live according to the rules, it's very easy to become accustomed to saying, well, everybody's doing it. And the first thing you know, what everybody is doing, a congressman or a senator or a president suddenly finds himself in the limelight with everybody pointing the accusing finger, and you have a human disaster occur. So sometimes people come and ask me to support them for running for Congress, and one did not so long ago, and he said, would you support me to run for Congress? And I said, no, I wouldn't. He said, I have a PhD degree in political science. I said, I know, but you don't know enough to be a congressman. You have never been in public life. You've never been in the state legislature. You have never done things through committees. You don't know what it takes to represent the people effectively in a legislative body. They would twist you around their little finger so fast you'd never know what happened to you back there. Well, he said, I don't agree with you. And I said, and I wouldn't agree with it either if I hadn't been back there. But you need to come up through the process, get all the experience you can before you run for these high offices. Because many a fine man went back there unprepared, not knowing about the difficulties, the traps, and so forth that can be set for him, and was destroyed as a public official because he just didn't recognize what the hazards were. So we want to encourage people to run for public office, but start down where you can handle it, and then get the experience and work up to these high offices. Now, will you read the summary with me, because we've gone through a very important part of our study course. The executive branch of the United States government has now become the power center of the world, and power blocks in labor, business, multinational banking groups, tax-exempt foundation, multinational corporations, United Nations promoters, and the advocates of a global or one world government have all tried to capture this branch of the United States government. This is particularly a dangerous threat to the people of the United States because the office of the President and the executive department under his supervision have broken loose from several important restrictions in the Constitution and are now in a position to impose abusive authority on the American people as well as a number of other nations who have been our friends, such as South Africa, Taiwan, Rhodesia, etc. The history of our relations with each of those countries is a painful one, a sorrowful one. The unconstitutional expansion of the power of the President include the following. Number one, making new laws by executive orders. Two, imposing highly restrictive or regulatory laws on the domestic affairs of the American people through the administrative agencies of the government, such as the Interstate Commerce Commission, OSHA, EPA, etc. Three, entering into executive agreements with foreign nations, sometimes in complete secrecy, so as to evade the necessity of making a formal treaty which would have to be approved by the Senate. And four, administering the distribution of tens of billions of dollars in government projects, which gives the President tremendous power to influence the votes of senators and congressmen whose districts and states will be the recipients of this money. And now five, administering billions of dollars in foreign aid, which can be given or withheld according to the President's sympathy or hostility toward the economic and political philosophy of a particular country. And number six, making grants of federal funds dependent on the obedience of the recipient to the policies and guidelines imposed unilaterally by the master planners in Washington. All right, now the Founding Fathers would say, Americans, pay attention. You've got something happening to you that is a disaster course if you continue down this road. Now you're capable of electing the kind of people into Congress who can recognize the problem, study the original Constitution, and get us back on the track. And then you can have a country that is free and prosperous and out of debt. Now, a very important part of this whole picture is the United States Supreme Court. And the Founding Fathers made it the referee to protect constitutional principles. So that's going to be a very interesting lesson, which we will begin next time. Lesson number 11 on the Supreme Court. Thank you.